Good morning, everyone. If you are new, my name is Sharon. I'm one of the pastors here at Bright City. And I want to begin by asking you a question that I really want you to take a moment to think about. When you were a kid and someone asked you, what do you want to be when you grow up? What did you say? When you were in elementary school, when you were in middle school, what was your answer? Well, for me, for most of elementary school and middle school, I had the same answer. If you had asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would have confidently told you, I am going to be an archaeologist. And the reason why I wanted to be an archaeologist was actually had nothing to do with Indiana Jones, but because of where we vacationed every single summer. Every summer, my family went to the beach in South Carolina, and we went to this specific beach that was on an island called Defusky Island. Defusky Island is really far south in South Carolina, so right across the water, you can actually see Hilton Head. And then if you look far to the south, you can actually make out Savannah, Georgia. So that kind of orients you to where Defusky Island is. But the thing that's really unique about Defusky Island is that for hundreds of years, this island was actually inhabited by a number of different Native American tribes. And so what we would do every single summer is we would go on the beach and we would walk along the beach. And this beach didn't look like a normal beach. It was full of roots and kind of trees sticking up because it used to be forest. So the water between Defusky Island and Hilton Head used to be much narrower, but over the centuries through erosion, it had widened and widened and widened. And so what is now the beach used to be wooded area. And so what was happening is the water would come in and it would pull the sand out and it would reveal all these roots underneath. But one of the things that it would also reveal underneath is these ancient artifacts. And so what we would do is we would go to the beach, and every single day we would walk along the beach and we would look and we would check in these roots, and we would find arrowheads, we would find spearheads, we would find working tools, we would find pottery shards that were really ornately decorated. And I wanted to share with you just a picture because I still have many of these. These are arrowheads that I found on the beach. Isn't that wild? Like, most people go to the beach and they just lay out. And I'm going out like unearthing these archaeological finds. But it was so amazing to me because we looked into the history of these and discovered that these are actually thousands of years old. And it was wild to me that I could hold this arrowhead and realize that no one has touched this for thousands of years. And to think about who was the person who made this and what was their life like. And this just captivated me. To this day, I still have a great love for history and visiting historical sites because of this. But because we did this every single summer for years, I thought this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. Now, as I got up into high school, that began to shift. Specifically, I took an AP psychology class that I really enjoyed and did really well in. And I did so well in this psychology class that at graduation, I won the psychology award, which I don't know what that means or how one wins it, but I was awarded this. And then that same year, my teacher actually pulled me aside and she said, I think you should consider studying this in college. Like, I think you'd be really good at this. I think you could be a counselor. Like, I think you are the kind of personality that could stay really calm in a crisis. And again, no idea, why she came up with this, why she said this to me. But I received this as a word from the Lord that this is what I was supposed to do for the rest of my life. So the next year when I went off to college, I was determined to major in psychology. And I stayed on that track until the end of my first semester of my freshman year, after which I had actually taken developmental psychology and realized I never want to do this again. And so I was off the psychology track pretty fast. Now, incidentally, if you had asked me during any of those years, do you ever think you would be called to ministry? Like, knowing what I do now, you're probably wondering, like, deep down, did she always know that she was going to be a pastor? And the truth is, if you had asked me if I would ever go into ministry, I would have laughed in your face. In fact, I remember when I was 15 or 16 years old, going to a conference, a Christian conference with my cousin, who's the same age as me. And at the end of this conference, they asked students to raise their hand if they felt called to vocational ministry. And I will never forget looking in shock and horror when my cousin raised her hand that she felt called to ministry, and then she stood up and went forward to dedicate her life to this. And I just remember thinking, like, why? Like, I could not imagine a more boring job. Now, I imagine we all have kind of similar stories from childhood. Like, however you answered that question of what, when you were 9 years old, what you wanted to be when you grew up, most likely that is not the thing that you are doing now. Because when we're kids, we say things like, I want to be a fireman, or I want to be a policeman, or I want to be a professional basketball player, professional football player. For years, my daughter Sadie said she wanted to be a cow milker. But the thing that I love about kid dream jobs is that they tend to be very impractical. Like, if you ask a 9-year-old, what do you want to be when you grow up, they don't look at you very seriously and say, well, I want competitive compensation and comprehensive health care and a 401k. No, they want to be a cow milker. And so they want to do basically what they're naming is what sounds fun to them. And that is where we all start. And yet, somewhere along the way, our concept of work begins to shift. We stop thinking in terms of dreams, and work becomes much more practical, much more utilitarian. For many of us, it is a source of struggle and turmoil. That is a conversation I have very, very often with many of you. Like, very often I'm standing in the lobby, I'm standing in the hallway. When I'm asking, how is work going? Rarely, and by rarely I mean literally never, does anyone ever say, it's going amazing. Like, I can't believe I get to do what I've always dreamed of. No one ever says that. The best answer I ever get is work is going fine. And more likely I get a groan, like, ugh, like it is what it is, For too many of us, work, or the lack thereof, is a pain point in our lives. But this morning, I would like to suggest that our kids, or our kids' selves, are a lot closer to God's vision for work than we are. In fact, for the next 4 weeks, we are going to be looking at God's vision for work. And part of the reason why we decided to do a series on this is that despite the fact that many of us spend 40 plus hours a week working, which that comes out to over 2,000 hours a year, the reality is that many of us, even those of us who are lifelong followers of Jesus, we have not thought biblically or theologically about this significant part of our lives. And so for the next 4 weeks, we are going to look at God's design for work, why we experience so much difficulty in our work, how to have a healthy relationship with work, how to discern your calling and vocation, and how to work with greater purpose. And this morning, we are going to begin with the basics, a biblical understanding of work and God's original design for it. And we find all of that, the answer to all those questions are right at the beginning of the Bible. It feels very fitting to start out the new year by starting in Genesis 1 and 2, but that is where we are going to be this morning, because right out of the gate at the beginning of the Bible, we get really this fleshed out vision of work directly from God. So we're going to start out in Genesis 1, verse 1, the very beginning of the Bible. This is a familiar verse to all of us. This is the creation story. And this is what it says, Genesis 1:1. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was an evening, and there was a morning, one day." So this is what God is doing on the first day of creation. He creates light, he creates day, he creates night. But as we continue reading in Genesis 1, we see that God does not stop there. He continues creating for 5 more days. He creates the waters. He creates the sky, the land, the fish, the birds, the animals. And then all this culminates with the creation of humanity on day 6. And all of that is in Genesis chapter 1, so the first chapter of the Bible. But as we turn the page to Genesis chapter 2, I want you to notice what it says next. So keep in mind, he spent 6 days creating. And then in Genesis 2, verse 1, it says, "So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. On the 7th day, God had completed his work that he had done. And he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the 7th day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all his work of creation." So what this language is telling us here is that God did not create the world through magic. He didn't just snap his fingers and suddenly it came into being. Genesis describes God's act of creating as his work. Now, as we read this and interpret this, and this kind of shapes our understanding of what it is that God is doing in Genesis 1, what is really tempting to do in this moment is to import all of our preconceived notions about work into this passage and to let it shape how we are conceiving of what it is that God is doing. And unfortunately, for many of us, our preconceived notions of work are negative. We think of it as being drudgery, about obligation, that it is hard. And so that shapes our interpretation of what God is doing here. And so we need to resist that temptation and kind of do the reverse and almost pretend like, imagine that you've never heard the word work before. And let this passage, let this context shape your understanding of what work is and what God intended it to be. Because by describing the act of creation as work, one of the first things this tells us that is really radical is that work existed before sin entered the world. I really love the way Tim Keller put it in his book, Every Good Endeavor. And I'm going to pop up a picture of this book where Tim Keller gives a really thorough treatment of like a theology of vocation. And so if you're looking to go deeper, I highly recommend this book. I really loved it. But in this book, this is what Tim Keller says. He says, work was not a necessary evil that came into the picture later, or something human beings were created to do, but that was beneath the great God himself. No, God worked for the sheer joy of it. In short, work was a part of paradise. It is inherently good. And of course, we experience pain and difficulty in work because sin later entered the world. And we're actually going to get into that next week. We're going to look at the effects of sin on work and why we experience so much hardship in work. But first, we need to start with God's original design for work in order to understand God's intention for it and our relationship with it. Because when we look at Genesis 1 and 2, we derive 3 biblical truths about work. The first is that work is an expression of God's character. When we look at what God is doing in Genesis 1 and 2, we do not see obligation. We do not see drudgery. We do not see him attempting to satisfy some arbitrary metric driven by this need to produce. Really, what we see is joy. Because what God is doing here is expressing who he is fundamentally. When we look at Genesis 1 and 2, we actually see 3 specific activities that are expressions of who God is. We see creation, cultivation, and caretaking. And each one of these is connected. It's not just what God does, but who he is. Starting with creating. God creates because God is creative. He is an artist. He is a dreamer. He has an infinite imagination. He dreams up incredible beauty. A couple years ago, Ike and I, we celebrated our anniversary in Utah at Zion National Park. Has anyone here been to Zion? I want to hear from you if anyone has been here. So it is unbelievable, and I want to put up a picture of this. This doesn't even begin to capture the beauty of this place. Every time Ike and I walked outside, I would comment to him, I would say, these mountains look like they were painted by the hand of God. I would walk outside and literally stagger backwards every single time because I could not get over the grandeur of these mountains. And when you look at a picture like this, and especially when you're in person, when you see it with your own eyes, you cannot deny that God is an artist because he is creative. But God is also a cultivator. He does not simply make lifeless, stagnant things, but he continues to shape them and craft them and grow them, not the least of which is you and I. God doesn't just create us, but he continues to cultivate us. And then God is also a caretaker in the most literal sense of the word. He takes care. He loves. He serves his creation. And so this helps us to define what work is according to God. Creating, cultivating, caretaking, or another synonym for caretaking would be serving. These are all activities that reflect the very essence of God, that he is loving, imaginative, that has this life-cultivating character. And so this work isn't just what he does, but who he is. And so that's the first thing we draw from this is work is an expression of God's character. But as we continue on, as we move out of Genesis 1 into Genesis 2, what we see is that humanity is created in the image of that God, which leads us to our second takeaway, which is that we were created to work. Earlier this week, I was talking to one of my kids. He had a lot of homework, and so he had spent hours working on this homework, and he was a little bit demoralized by it because it was like kind of dawning on him that there was only going to be more work going forward. And he was just groaning and moaning about this is going to be, the next however many years of my life. And one of the crosses to bear of being a pastor's kid is that you get sermon content sort of tested out on you. And so I knew I was going to be preaching on this topic. And so I said to him, well, actually, you were created to work. And in that moment, it wasn't like a light shined down on him and his mind was illuminated and suddenly he recognized, the purpose and the meaning in his schoolwork. Instead, his response was all the joy drained out of his eyes. And it was as if I had just delivered to him the worst news ever. This is the rest of my life. Even after school, I'm going to be working. And again, this is because most of us have a negative understanding of work. But if that is you, that phrase that you were created to work, if that sounds horrible to you, I want you to just hang with me for a second. I want to have this opportunity to reframe it for you. Because one of the things that I really love about Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is they really parallel one another. In Genesis 1, you have this picture of God creating and cultivating. And then in Genesis 2, you have this picture of humanity now doing the exact same thing, creating and cultivating. Because what God does in Genesis 2 is he commissions humanity to do the very same work that he was just doing. Just to give you one example, in Genesis 2:15, it says, "The Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and watch over it." Now, that said, is God commissioning humanity into this work simply because he doesn't want to do it anymore? Is he commissioning us to be his servants? Is that what is happening here? No. The reason that God commissions humanity into the same work that he was just doing is he wants humanity to share in his joy. He wants us to use our imaginations to dream with him. He wants us to use our hands to craft and to build and to cultivate with him. He wants us to use our hearts to care for and serve others with him, because this is the work that we were created for. Now, I don't think it goes without saying that this is the literal opposite of how our world thinks about work. We are not a world that lives as if we have been commissioned to do great things in the world. We are a culture that lives for leisure. Work is a thing that we white knuckle our days through to get to the weekend when we can travel or do the things that we really enjoy. Or we are working right now so that one day we can retire when we can stop working. But we don't see that in Genesis 1. We see the opposite. What we see in Genesis 1 is God gives himself 6 days to work and only 1 day to rest and to enjoy his creation. But it doesn't stop there, because later on, God instructs us to imitate this rhythm. He sets aside 1 day for Sabbath to rest and to enjoy creation. But God has actually, and we never talk about this, but God has actually ordained for us a 6-day work week. Have you ever thought about that before? We are in a culture that is rigidly, it is a 5-day work week, 4 if I am lucky. But as followers of Jesus who submit our lives to God's word, he has ordained a 6-day work week. Why would God do that? Is it because he is cruel? Is it because he's a slave driver? Is it because he is driven by the bottom line? No. It's because we were not created to be passive consumers. We were created to be active participants in this world at our core. That's what we were created for. And while sickness and aging absolutely can inhibit that at times, it does not change the fact that leisure is not the purpose of your soul. A life oriented primarily around the pursuit of consumption and ease is ultimately a life without meaning. Because you were created to create. You were created to cultivate. You were created to care for this world and the people around you. We miss this meaning, this purpose, when we think that work is just a synonym for source of income, when it is in fact so much more. I mean, just think about, what do you do in your spare time? If you use your spare time to garden or to write or to knit or to paint or to make furniture, to restore an old car, to read and learn, keep in mind, reading and learning, that is cultivating your mind. When you serve here at Bright City, when you serve in the community, when you invite people into your home to feed them a delicious meal, this also is the very good work that God has created you to do. I really love the way author Dorothy Sayers says this, and this is so radical. But she says, work is not primarily a thing one does to live, but the thing one lives to do. It is, or it should be, the full expression of the worker's faculties, the thing in which he finds spiritual, mental, and bodily satisfaction, and the medium in which he offers himself to God. Imagine if we thought of work that way. It is a high and holy calling that God created us for, which leads to the final truth that we derive from Genesis 1 and 2, which is that work has dignity. Yes, we work in a broken, fallen world where work can be discouraging and dehumanizing, where we work with really difficult people. But the truth at its core is that work in its many different forms is still an echo of God's original design for it. That original commission to create, to cultivate, and to care. And when you think of it that way, it changes the way you see so many different types of work. Just to give you one example, last week I was at Panera, and I was standing at the counter waiting for my food, and I was watching the woman who was working the counter. And this poor woman, she was running around like a chicken with her head cut off. She was running between the kitchen and the counter and filling people's orders and calling people's names and answering questions. And I was looking at her thinking, like, this woman is 100% going to get her step count for today. Like, it was a crazy, crazy time of day. But at one point, I recalled what I had been reading about and researching for this series. And then all of a sudden, I saw what she was doing in a totally different light. Because I realized what this woman was doing really was helping to feed us. She was helping to feed every single person. She was caretaking for us. And that is a sacred, important, beautiful thing. That is how we see our work differently when we receive this vision from Genesis 1 and 2. Just a few other examples. If you are a teacher, for example, what you are really doing is you are cultivating young hearts and minds. If you are a counselor or a doctor or a nurse, you are caring for people when they are especially vulnerable. If you're leading a startup, which is really hard and really scary because what you're doing is creating something new. If you work in construction, you are creating homes and spaces for people to live, work, and play. If you work in the hospitality industry, you are taking care of people when they are away from their homes. If you clean houses or places of work, you are serving and caretaking so that these spaces are clean and safe for others. If you work in IT, I want you to know you are caretaking for me. You have been sent to take care of me because I don't understand technology at all, and I thank you for your service. If you are a stay-at-home parent, you are really doing all three. You are creating a home, you are cultivating the hearts and minds of your kids, you are caring for them. And if you are a student, if you are in middle school or high school or college or grad school, a big part of your work right now is cultivating your character and your mind. Work, as God exemplifies it, reframes how we think about our jobs, instilling them with a high and holy dignity. But at the same time, this understanding of work reminds us that work is something we're all commissioned into regardless of whether we have a job or not. God has commissioned all of us to create, to cultivate, and to care for the world around us. Amen? Going back to my initial story of vocational discernment and how I thought ministry was the worst possible job. God obviously had the last laugh. He called me into ministry later on in college, where I would soon discover ministry is not boring at all. It is challenging. It is rigorous. It is at times very difficult. If you want an easy, comfortable life, I do not recommend this work any more than I would recommend being a teacher or a nurse or a social worker or a police officer or an artist or being a stay-at-home parent. These are all very challenging vocations in very different ways. And yet, despite the challenge, all of us, we are compelled to do this work because deep down we know we were created for it. The fact of the matter is you were created with great capacity to do incredible things as long as you sense the purpose in it. And so maybe you need that reminder this morning of your high calling. Maybe you're in a job right now that initially you felt called to, but because it is hard, because it is discouraging, you have become disconnected from that sense of purpose. And so you need to reconnect with the aspect of your job that is about creating or cultivating or caring for this world and others. Maybe you have a job that you would not have chosen. Like you just needed a job, and this is the job that you got. And you need the reminder that that job, it has dignity. And in some way, it is an echo of God's greater design for all work. Maybe you don't have a job right now, and you need this reminder that you are still commissioned to create, to cultivate, and to care for this world. What might that look like in this season? Or maybe your overall orientation to work, if you're being honest, has slowly become the reverse of what we see in Genesis 1 and 2, where you really live for leisure. The purpose of your work is to save enough for vacation or retirement, not to exercise good dominion over the world. And so you need to be restored to that broader purpose. But right now, I want to invite you to take some time to reflect on your current perspective, your current relationship to work, and how what we see in Genesis 1 and 2, how it meets you, corrects you, restores you. And I'm going to invite our prayer team forward as well, because work is a source of pain for a lot of you. Whether you need a job, maybe you're at a fork in the road, maybe your work environment is just demoralizing, we would be honored to pray for you. But let's take some time now, wherever you find yourself, to process this with the Lord right now.